I'm going to introduce Devdip Ganguli. Ganguli? How do I say? Ganguli. He's going to be speaking today on Sri Aurobindo and Vedantic Self-realisation, a pathway to radical sustainability. Thank you, Devdip.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee, for this wonderful opportunity, and to CIS. It's such a pleasure to be here and to visit the campus in person. Um, I want to offer a contemplative exploration of sustainability through the integral perspective of Sri Aurobindo. And let's start from when the term starts to get more defined. So in 1987, you have the United Nations Brundtland Commission, which ushers in the term in popular public discourse. And how it defines the concept is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Later on, over time, so in 2016, closer to where we are, the UCLA Sustainability Committee, I've just taken something different organizations grappling with the concept of sustainability. So UCLA comes up with this charter, which says, it's a more contemporary understanding, which says the integration, interesting word, the integration of environmental health, social equity, and economic vitality. I've just extracted a portion. So, what is interesting is that the praxis of sustainability is linked with these three pillars: economy, society, and environment. In a paper by Purvis, Mao, and Robinson, they argue that these three pillars do not have a single point of origin, but they emerge eventually over time. When I reflect on this focus and these definitions, somewhere we have to confront the continuing echoes of the post Enlightenment project of modernity. Because this is an age in which, as we know, knowledge is produced by virtue of the objectivization of the world. And even in the face of opposition and an apparent change in sensibilities, when you think about where we are today, our actions continue to be driven by a worldview that sees nature, societies, and collective groups in terms of this Heideggerian standing reserve that has to be exploited, dominated, or manipulated. And even our current discourse on sustainability, for all its good intentions, belies the fundamental challenge of dealing with finite resources from the standpoint of an egoic consciousness that has unlimited hunger. And so, amusingly, our efforts to persuade the general public about the necessity of sustainability only achieve success when the consequences play out in drastic terms. When you have natural disasters, raging wildfires, intense storms, events that bring home to the egoistic consciousness that its existence is threatened if it does not change its way of being. And the intrinsic limitation of this approach is that it leverages self interest to foster change. And it leads to the untenable, even unsustainable position that only radical devastation can lead to radical change. And we have to consider another approach to the problem. And so I turn to Sri Aurobindo's work on social and political thought, which is the human cycle, which looks at the development of human societies through certain stages or cycles. And he proposes 4 stages of the cycle. We leave aside the first 3 and jump straight into the modern era and talk about the individualistic or the rational stage. And this stage is it coincides with the project of modernity, and it gives rise to forms of power that essentially subjugated the individual. And the response to that objectivization, the response to that project of power, comes through the beginnings of what he terms the subjective age. So what is the subjective age? Essentially, it implies an active movement of self-consciousness. So by leveraging reason and action based on a progressive illumination of the will, by a quest for true identity, a quest for true sense of self. There is an attempt to instead of living according to universal laws of physics or science, to live according to what Sri Aurobindo calls the veiled law and will and power active in life and the world. And this subjective attempt, we find the earliest responses to subjectivism, we find in the challenge to colonialism, when fledgling nation identities were seeking to ask themselves who they truly were, what was their collective self worth, self expression, self identity. So, the early Irish freedom movement, for example, or the early Indian revolutionary movement that was born in Bengal in the early 20th century, imaged the nation as a motherland. It indicated that people were seeking for an ontological rebirth. And so, this urge to be completely and as fully oneself is what defines the subjective period of humanity. So, there is an epistemological pendulum swing from an objective self view to a growing subjectivism. And so, the first attempts at this subjective manifestation of national identities can sometimes be very crude. And what is interesting is that Sri Aurobindo, some of you would be aware, he was in the freedom movement. He spearheaded it for about 4 years. He was in the heart of it, thick of it, and then he comes to Pondicherry and he withdraws from active politics. And just a year after coming to Pondicherry, he has this really insightful letter. It's a personal correspondence where he says just a year after he has withdrawn from the political movement, he says to someone, be very careful to follow my instructions in avoiding the old kind of politics. And he says God has struck it all down: moderatism, nationalism, terrorism. By terrorism here he means the violent reaction to British rule, the use of violence and so on. And he says, not that he had an ideological problem with that, but he says the entire form that the movement took was problematic. He says, at present, I do not regard the British coercion as an enemy but as a helper. If it can only get rid us of this wild pamphleteering, these theatrical assassinations, these frenzied appeals to national hatred with their watchword of kill the foreigner, these childish conspiracies, etc. And he says, only when this foolishness is done with, that truth will have a chance, the sattvic or the purified mind in India emerge and a really strong spiritual movement begin as a prelude to India's regeneration. So, what this tells us is that even for someone like Sri Aurobindo, who was crucial in fostering that subjective identity in India, he was also conscious of the dangers of that subjectivism. And he terms this as false subjectivism in the human cycle. And he gives the example of another contemporary society undergoing this dichotomy, this challenge with self identity, and that was modern Germany. Now, between 1871 and the First World War, Germany sees this incredible rise in power and status. And also, this coincides with the political unification of the different German principalities. And so, what is interesting is that if you think about the movements that took place in Germany through the 19th century, through its thinkers, its philosophers, there is this growing sense of what is the German identity. And once again, there we find in a much more pronounced way the turn towards false subjectivism. So, we see, for example, what happens with the German experiment. I think you're all aware of the history, so I don't need to go into that. But it goes into a paranoia of identity seeking, which actually ends up becoming the very opposite of what it should have been, which is a deeper sense of grounding. Instead, it becomes a wanting to appropriate and conquer and invade. And that becomes connected with the German identity. So, Sri Aurobindo says the dangers of error in this process of subjective seeking are as great and far reaching as the results of right seeking. I want to bring in here two stories from the Upanishads very quickly. How much time do I have? Great. So, two stories from the Upanishads. So, the first story is about Brigu, and he approaches his father and says, teach me about the eternal. And his father, who is also a Vedic god, Varuna, says that food, prana is vital breath, life, energy, eye and ear and mind and speech are the steps to realize the eternal. And what Brigu does is he concentrates, he meditates upon each of these sort of levels of reality. And at each level, he starts with food, annam, the material body itself. And he says, this is who I am, this is my reality. But then he doesn't stop there. He goes back to his father, and his father leads him step by step to these other layers of identity and consciousness. So the whole story, I'm just saying it in a very brief manner, is a kind of call to continuously grow from one level or layer of identity to deeper or higher layer of identity. A similar story we find with Prajapati and Indra. So Prajapati is like the creator of the universe, and he says, whoever, I have a knowledge to give, and whoever receives this knowledge achieves mastery of all the realms. And so the gods and the demons, they each send a kind of representative. And when they arrive, Prajapati, it's also a very interesting story. First, he makes them wait for 32 years. And then eventually he says, look into a pan of water. And what you find in that pan of water is the ultimate, the knowledge of the ultimate reality. And they both look in the pan of water, the representative of the gods and the asuras. And um, they go back to Prajapati and they say, we see ourselves. And the demons, the asuras, the representative says, I am satisfied with this knowledge. This is the full knowledge of the ultimate truth. Indra is not convinced, and he goes back and says, if I'm dismembered, if I lose a limb, does that mean that the totality of the ultimate truth is somehow diminished? Doesn't make sense. And then Prajapati says, good, and then he makes him wait for another 30 odd years. And then gradually, again the same story, gradually takes him layer by layer into the totality of the truth. The point is that there is a continuum when it comes to self identity. It is not something that is reached, it is something that continues to grow and expand and deepen until it reaches a point of, almost like a tangential infinity, which then becomes the true, self. So I want to reflect a little bit on what we understand by this Vedantic self-realization, because it's central to the idea of a truly sustainable society. So what is that? The Upanishads say, these ancient Hindu texts, which are at least 3,000 years, if not older, they repeatedly reiterate, discover thyself, tattvamasi, you are that. But what is that? And that they say is the Brahman, the ultimate reality. The Brahman is absolute, eternal, infinite. It is ever unborn, ever unchanged. But it is also the source of all manifestation, the essence of all existence. Thus, the Brahman paradoxically is one, but it is also the many. And the key to our quandaries, the road to our redemption, is essentially to contemplate and to consider what this means. How can one be the many? And this truth forces us to reconsider our likes, our dislikes, our prejudices, our affections, our love, our hatred, and an introspection into this cosmology, which is imbued with the reality of a single truth that is at once, a multiplicity, compels us to transcend this ratiocinative, rational approach to existence and life. And this brings about a spontaneous, inherent interconnectedness of all existence. And this interconnectedness is the root of all sustainability, perceiving and acting from that sense that our actions have a direct an immediate effect on the other, on reality, on nature, is what sustainability really is about. And so the divisions and dichotomies that characterize the human condition are no longer inevitable. The paradox of ordinary perception replaced by the riddle of an infinite reality truly made finite. So I'm just going to skip a little bit to keep to the time and say that when we think about sustainability in these terms, it is no longer about three pillars that we talked about, or not only about the three pillars. Of course, economy, society, environment are important, but our preoccupation turns towards a more integral sense that ties into the existence and well being of all animate and inanimate world. When the Indian mystic Ramana Maharshi was asked, how should we treat others from a spiritual standpoint? He replied, there is no other. And this is really the key to the Vedantic sense of sustainability that I'm trying to put forth. So today we find that this march of subjectivism is inevitable. Nations around the world continue to seek for their truth, their identity in a post-colonial context. It almost seems like the project of humanism and human unity are compromised. We seem to be, going into more and more silos rather than expanding into a greater sense of awareness with the world. So it's again paradoxical that the more we advance, we are somehow getting more closed in upon ourselves. But the movement is inevitable. There has to be a greater seeking of identity. We cannot revert back to a state where we define ourselves in any other terms. So Sri Aurobindo gives a few pointers to the coming of a truly spiritual age. He says, for example, that one of the signs would be the general readiness of the common mind for spiritual realities and truths. He says this readiness would be declared in fields such as psychology, philosophy, art, poetry, painting, sculpture, music. Science itself would open itself to new possibilities. And here at CIS, we are at the center. It's one of the dynamic centers of this change and transformation. It's really important what it stands for. And these are all steps on the ladder of this collective transcendence towards a fully spiritualized Gnostic society. Now, the establishment of Auroville by the mother in 1968 directly addresses the dream of what we are calling in this conference a sustainable integral civilization. And there are a number of papers that are going to explore Auroville, so I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to delve deeper into it. There's been a group from CIS who spent 3 weeks in Auroville last month. So there'll be many perspectives that will emerge. But I will just say this, that the dangers and challenges that we just outlined in terms of subjectivism and false subjectivism, they continue to play out today at the level of nations, at the level of communities. We are still struggling with what it means to really anchor ourselves in the highest and truest part of ourselves. And so there is a danger of boxing spirituality in any kind of religious mold or idea or action, and an attitude, and also to be wary of an attitude that judges the success of an endeavor on material terms. We are dealing essentially with the field of consciousness, and it is only consciousness that perceives the work of consciousness. It cannot be judged on the basis of any kind of quantitative numbers. Those are always problematic. Not that they need to be ignored. We have to, of course, integrate all these different viewpoints, but it's important to anchor ourselves in what really matters. And the other thing Sri Aurobindo is very categorical about is that the coming of a spiritual age or a subjective society requires as much freedom as possible. This freedom, he says, even the freedom to make mistakes is essential, because compulsion or any kind of external rule or machinery can create an appearance of perfection, but in the end, it does not lead to a fundamental change of consciousness. That has always to be arrived at from within. And so the aim before a perfectly spiritual society would really be a divine anarchy. And what I mean by a divine anarchy is a government by this highest sense of self, for this highest sense of self, and uh, you know of this highest sense of self. So needless to say, this is not an argument in favor of unbridled self assertion. Freedom should not be mistaken for that either, but it is a call to really consider acting in the light of the highest ideal, in the spirit of true collaboration, and not with the use of force or coercion. The spiritual age essentially cannot be legislated or gazetted into existence. It has to be lived and manifested out of ourselves. And so we can apply this lens to many different problems of the world today, whether they happen in communities or at the level of nations. And I just want to end by saying that the road towards a truly integral, sustainable civilization is something which is fairly clear. In the measure that we arrive at inner perfection, can we manifest it outwardly? And in the measure that we realize the self within and give it a body, a shape, a form that is as undistorted and as true to that infinitude and aspect of perfection that it seeks to manifest, we will move towards a truly integral and sustainable civilization. So I'll end with that.
So I want to begin. Can you hear me?
Mm,
Okay. I want to begin by thanking you. This is, to
I,
paraphrase Kant.
I think the mic is still not on.
How do you do it?
Yeah.
What am I doing wrong?
Yeah, now it's good. Now it's good.
Closer to my mouth. There I
Yeah.
am. So, to begin again, I want to thank you because, to paraphrase Kant, you have just awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. Um, you did it right at the beginning. You basically, if not accused, your critique was that many of us who have been engaged in the great work of our time, which is dealing with the planetary crisis, have been engaging in emotional blackmail. What we have been saying is either think the way we do or you will die.
Yeah.
And you said that's wrong, and you were absolutely correct. And so that you have my whole approach to my own work has now changed, because I'd thought about that from time to time, but you brought it into focus again. You're absolutely correct. So as here's my question: as you are my teacher for today, Acharya,
Mm.
there is the matter of the three pillars, and I know you may not be able to answer this very well, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Okay, so we can say that we can have Auroville and other small communities, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a contemplative civilization. Do you have any thoughts about where the rubber meets the road? How, in terms of the three pillars, economics, ecology, and whatever the third one was, can you give us any preliminary vision about how that might actually work in practical terms of community of governance? That's my question.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I think the first thing is that the nature of public discourse has to expand to include a discussion on consciousness. And what this means is to reflect upon and review all the aspects that make up our civilization, starting with education, how we've organized our societies, our economies. And I'm not saying that we can radically change overnight, but what we can do is to bring that focus into discussion so that we can question some of the assumptions with which we organize our collective life. The assumptions, for example, being that if you provide materially, then you have done your work as a society, or that if we are comfortable, somehow we have achieved what we want to be as human beings. So I think just bringing in that other question itself starts to make us reflect on what do we need to do in order to change the way we look at ourselves collectively and individually. I think that would really be the starting point, and then it expands to everything. Yeah, but I mean, it's a profound question, and I don't think like we can really go deeper than that. But yeah, but thank you for asking. Yeah. Yes, we have somebody here. Yeah.
Um, as a tangent from this fantastic first question, do you have this may be disgusting to ask it this way, but do you have a metric by which you and colleagues and those in your transformational inquiring circle of beings that you identify and reflect upon in order to not become discouraged?
Yeah.
Because I think the discouragement of the vastness, the overwhelm
Of the problem. Yeah.
For a lot of the young people, especially, is let's not pay attention. It's too ugly. It's too depressing. It's a bummer. I'll smoke more weed. I'll drink more booze.
I think that's really the value of intentional communities. These are spaces which allow you to have a kind of I don't want to use the word brotherhood, but family.
Buoyance.
Yeah, of of um, of shared intention, and ultimately the whole premise of my presentation is that really change begins from the individual. But the more such individuals come together, even if it may not be in physical spaces, like what we do, for example, in the EWP Acts program, with Professor Banerjee and all the other teachers, we have a community of people all over the world that we are just we are meeting online, and we are exploring these questions and thinking about them. And when we do get the opportunity to meet in person, as we are now, it's like we hardly know each other, but we know each other so well, because everyone is on this journey in their own way. And that's what makes it so fascinating and colorful. I'm doing it in my way, and Jean-Michel is doing it in his way, and everyone else is doing it in their own ways, and that makes it precious. So I would say it's really important that these nodes or centers around which people gather, like CIIS and Auroville and the Sri Aurobindo ashram, and so many other communities. It's not only about Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but everywhere where there is this intention to manifest something deeper, those are really the little beacons of light everywhere. And they're growing, not only in number, but also they're deepening in quality. And so I'm hopeful, notwithstanding the yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Devdip. I think I really enjoyed your presentation, and you brought up so many things that are so profound and thought-provoking, particularly from Sri Aurobindo's teachings. I think one of the really important ones that bears a lot of contemplation is this dichotomy between true and false subjectivism. To look back, we've seen a lot of false subjectivism. Actually, false subjectivism has to do with trying to, as you were pointing out, trying to stereotype one's inner nature, in a sense, and also collectivize it. This is who we are. It builds an identity, and that identity sticks, and immediately it creates an us and them.
Yes.
A defined identity already always presupposes the other of that identity, and that whole question about there is no other comes in over there. So as against that false identity, when you're saying that there is a subjectivism in a subjective age, which is not just an individual but a collective subjectivism, how would you say that that can develop a true subjectivism, can develop and avoid this natural tendency towards self-enclosure?
Yeah. I would go back to the two stories from the Upanishads, because they're really instructive in reminding us that wherever, whatever layer of identity we discover and identify with, we must ask ourselves, is this enough? Is this all? Is there something else that I need to further assimilate, integrate, arrive at? And so this somehow this perception of self-awareness that however far we have reached, there is more to go, is important. And just having that sense of, I don't want to use the word doubt, but questioning whatever our certitudes or certainties are about ourselves and the world should be questioned in a healthy way so that they enlarge and deepen in scope. So I think that is important. And the tendency with the reason why false subjectivism is so pervasive is because the amount of energy and strength and power you get from this quest for identity can be vitiated if it stops there. And that's what, Bhrigu, the son of Varuna, and Indra and Prajapati are reminding us, that keep going, and still there is a beyond. And as long as that stays open, I think, in spite of the errors and mistakes, we can move forward.
Thanks. I think related to that also, when we are talking about Auroville, or you also mentioned
Yes.
CIIS
Yes.
and the variety, I think the porosity of these, subjective collectives or subjective ideas is very important in actually engaging with the other as the self.
Yes, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think so. So that's exactly where, when the mother sets up Auroville as a kind of a diverse collective, each collective, each identity, each subjectivity is in relation. It's a true subjectivism. Would you say that true subjectivism must always be one that grows in relation?
Absolutely. It's yeah. Otherwise, we fall into the error of past spirituality, because the fullness of the self is very adequate and satisfactory for oneself. But it's that in relation to the other and the enriching of that exchange that really makes it a living truth in the collectivity. All right. Thank you.